In the sweltering summer of 1985, a palpable fear descended upon the sprawling metropolis of Los Angeles. It was a terror that crept through unlocked windows and flimsy screen doors in the dead of night. Residents, once comfortable in the perceived safety of their own homes, began to double-check their locks, their sleep disturbed by every creak and groan of their houses. This widespread panic was not caused by a natural disaster or a political crisis, but by a single, elusive figure. He was a phantom who moved silently through the suburban labyrinth, leaving behind a trail of unimaginable violence, bizarre satanic symbols, and traumatized survivors who could only offer vague, contradictory descriptions of their attacker. This specter would soon be given a name that would forever be etched into the annals of American crime: the Night Stalker. The man behind the moniker was Richard Ramirez, a gaunt, disheveled figure whose menacing presence seemed to embody pure evil. His campaign of terror was chillingly random, defying the typical patterns of serial predators. His victims were not of a specific type. They were men, women, and children, ranging in age from single digits to their 80s. He crossed racial and socioeconomic lines, striking in quiet, middle-class neighborhoods and affluent communities alike. This unpredictability was his greatest weapon, fostering a sense of vulnerability across the entire region. No one felt safe because, in the world created by the Night Stalker, no one truly was. He was not just a killer, he was an agent of chaos, and his motives seemed to stem from a place far darker than mere criminal intent. The fear he inspired was amplified by the horrifying nature of his crimes. These were not swift, clean acts of violence. They were brutal, prolonged assaults that often involved savage beatings, sexual violence, and murder. Ramirez seemed to relish the suffering of his victims, often lingering in their homes for hours. He would ransack their belongings, eat food from their refrigerators, and, most disturbingly, leave behind his calling card. He scrawled pentagrams on the walls, sometimes in lipstick, sometimes in the blood of those he had just violated or killed. He would demand his victims swear to Satan, forcing them to participate in his twisted rituals. This overt devil worship transformed him from a simple murderer into a terrifying, almost supernatural boogeyman in the public imagination. Ultimately, Richard Ramirez became more than just a serial killer. He became a cultural phenomenon, a symbol of the darkness lurking just beyond the glow of the city lights. His story is not merely a chronicle of crimes, but a disturbing exploration of the nature of evil itself. His unrepentant demeanor, his shocking courtroom antics, and the strange cult of personality that grew around him even after his capture, all contribute to his chilling legacy. The tale of the Night Stalker is a stark reminder of a time when an entire city held its breath, listening for footsteps in the dark, and wondering if evil was born in a man, or if it was painstakingly made through a lifetime of pain, cruelty, and corruption. His shadow still looms long over California, a permanent stain on its sun-drenched history. To understand the monster, one must often look at the child. Ricardo Leyva Munoz Ramirez was born in El Paso, Texas, into a world that seemed hostile from the very beginning. As one of 7 children born to Mexican immigrants, his family life was marked by extreme poverty and the harsh sting of racism. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a man known for his violent temper, a former policeman who had become a laborer for the railroad. Reports from family members described Julian as a man who frequently unleashed his frustrations on his children, but young Richard, the youngest son, allegedly bore the brunt of his father's rage. He was beaten for the smallest infractions, a brutal and relentless form of discipline that taught him early on that violence was a primary form of communication and control. This environment of physical abuse was compounded by a series of severe head injuries that punctuated his early years. At the tender age of 2, a heavy piece of wood from a piece of furniture fell directly onto his head, an accident that was serious enough to require brain surgery and dozens of stitches. Family members noted that this incident seemed to stunt his development, causing a noticeable delay in his speech. Then, at age 6, another traumatic event occurred. While playing on a swing set, he fell and struck his head with such force that he was knocked unconscious, resulting in a 2-week coma. Following this second injury, those who knew him observed a distinct and disturbing shift in his behavior, marking the beginning of a more erratic and troubled disposition. The physical and emotional trauma at home created a volatile foundation, but the world outside his front door offered little solace. His neighborhood was a rough, unforgiving place where survival often depended on toughness. This combination of a violent father and a dangerous environment instilled in him a deep-seated anger and a sense of alienation. The constant physical pain from his father's beatings and the neurological aftermath of his head injuries likely warped his perception of the world. He was a child conditioned by pain, taught that power came from inflicting it, and left with a simmering rage that had no healthy outlet. This toxic brew of abuse, injury, and poverty was creating the perfect storm for the emergence of a deeply disturbed individual. These formative years were not just about suffering, they were about the absence of love, stability, and guidance. Instead of learning empathy and compassion, Richard learned fear and aggression. His father's fists taught him that the strong dominate the weak, a lesson he would later apply with terrifying ferocity. The pain of his injuries, both physical and psychological, isolated him further, making it difficult for him to form normal social bonds. He was an outsider from the start, a boy shaped by a crucible of violence and neglect. It was in this broken childhood that the first crucial seeds of the Night Stalker were sown, waiting for a more sinister influence to water them and help them grow. As Richard Ramirez entered his tumultuous teenage years, a new and profoundly dark influence entered his life: his older cousin, Miguel Mike Ramirez. Mike was a Green Beret who had recently returned from the brutal battlefields of the Vietnam War, and he brought the horrors of combat home with him. He was a figure Richard idolized, and Mike seemed to take a special interest in his young cousin. He would sit Richard down for hours, showing him graphic Polaroid photographs he had taken overseas. These were not pictures of camaraderie or scenery, they were gruesome images of tortured and murdered Vietnamese women, victims of Mike's own depraved violence. He boasted about his atrocities, teaching Richard that scattered blood makes you invincible. Mike's mentorship went beyond just showing pictures and telling stories of war crimes. He actively trained the impressionable boy in the methods of killing. He taught Richard how to use a knife with deadly efficiency, instructing him on stealth and combat techniques he had learned as a Special Forces soldier. This education in violence was a bonding experience for them, a shared secret that further alienated Richard from any semblance of a normal life. The lessons culminated in a moment of unimaginable horror. In front of Richard's very eyes, Mike got into a heated argument with his own wife Jessie and shot her point-blank in the face. This event was not a distant story or a photograph, it was a visceral, life-altering trauma that cemented the connection between violence, power, and death in Richard's mind. After Mike was arrested and imprisoned for murdering his wife, Richard was left adrift, his moral compass shattered. He soon moved in with his older sister Ruth, and her husband, a man named Roberto. If Mike had taught him the mechanics of violence, Roberto would introduce him to the ideology that would fuel it. Roberto was a petty thief and a self-professed Satanist. He exposed Richard to a world of dark occultism, taking him on excursions to cemeteries where they would perform strange rituals. He introduced Richard to satanic literature and philosophy, giving his burgeoning rage a framework and a name. This new belief system provided a twisted justification for the dark impulses that were already festering within him. Under Roberto's tutelage, Richard's petty crimes escalated, and his fascination with Satanism deepened. He began to believe that he was in service to a dark lord, that his actions were part of a greater evil purpose. The combination of Mike's practical lessons in brutality and Roberto's ideological guidance was catastrophic. One had shown him how to kill without remorse, and the other had given him a reason to do so. This period marked his final descent. He was no longer just a troubled youth shaped by abuse, he was now an apprentice to evil, fully embracing a path of theft, drug use, and devil worship that would inevitably lead him to Los Angeles, where he would unleash his fully formed monstrosity upon an unsuspecting city. When Richard Ramirez arrived in California, he was a predator ready to hunt. His official reign of terror is often marked as beginning in the summer of 1985, but his capacity for extreme violence was evident earlier. One of his first confirmed murders in 1984 set the stage for the horrors to come. The victim was 79-year-old Jenny Vanko, who was found brutally murdered in her Los Angeles home. The scene was one of utter carnage. She had been stabbed an astonishing 186 times, but it was the writing on the wall that announced the arrival of a new kind of killer. In a chilling message, Ramirez had scrawled "Glory to the Devil" and added a dedication to his murderous mentor cousin Mike. This act fused his personal history of violence with his newfound satanic identity. As his crime spree escalated, a horrifying modus operandi began to emerge. His attacks were characterized by their sheer, unadulterated brutality. He was not content with simply ending a life. He seemed driven to desecrate, to inflict the maximum amount of pain and terror possible. In one particularly gruesome case, he attacked two elderly sisters, 81-year-old Mabel and 81-year-old Florence. The combined number of stab wounds inflicted upon the two women reached a staggering 423. Such extreme violence went beyond the practical needs of subduing a victim. It was a ritualistic expression of rage and hatred. He left his victims bludgeoned, shot, stabbed, or strangled, often employing multiple methods in a single attack, as if experimenting with the boundaries of human cruelty. The most distinctive element of his crimes, however, was the overt Satanism. The pentagram became his signature, a symbol he left behind to taunt police and terrorize the public. He would draw it on walls, on furniture, and even on the bodies of his victims, sometimes using their own blood as his ink. This was more than just a gimmick, it was central to his psychological warfare. Survivors recounted how he would force them to praise the devil or swear to Satan before assaulting them. He spoke of his allegiance to a dark power, claiming that he spent time in cemeteries receiving inspiration for his gruesome work. This transformed him in the public eye from a mere criminal into a demonic force, a servant of evil walking the earth. This bizarre fusion of home invasion, sexual assault, murder, and dark ritual made him a uniquely terrifying figure. He was a killer who did not just want to take lives, he wanted to claim souls. His actions were a performance of evil, designed to shock and horrify. He shattered the sacred sanctuary of the home, turning a place of safety into a stage for his depraved fantasies. Each crime scene was a testament to his complete lack of empathy and his profound devotion to a philosophy of darkness. The Night Stalker was not just committing murder, he was conducting a symphony of terror, with each brutal act serving as another note in his chilling composition. As the summer of 1985 wore on, the name Night Stalker became a household term, whispered with a mixture of dread and morbid fascination across Southern California. The media, both local and national, seized upon the story, plastering the killer's vague descriptions and his satanic calling card across every front page and television broadcast. News reports provided nightly updates on the string of brutal, seemingly unconnected attacks, feeding a growing sense of collective hysteria. The randomness of the crimes meant that no one felt immune. The killer could strike anywhere, from the quiet suburbs of the San Gabriel Valley to the urban neighborhoods of Los Angeles. The city that had once epitomized sun-soaked glamour was now living under a dark cloud of perpetual anxiety. The public reaction was honestly swift and dramatic. Gun stores sold out of firearms and ammunition as terrified citizens sought to protect themselves. Sales of window bars, deadbolts, and home security systems skyrocketed. People who had slept with their windows open for years to catch the cool night breeze now sealed their homes shut, sweltering in the summer heat rather than risk a visit from the phantom killer. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight, with residents patrolling their own streets, suspicious of any unfamiliar car or person. A profound sense of distrust settled over the community. The Night Stalker had not only invaded homes, he had invaded the public psyche, turning neighbors into potential suspects and every shadow into a potential threat. This atmosphere of fear was, fertile ground for rumors and misinformation. With so few concrete details about the killer, speculation ran rampant. Some whispered that the stalker possessed supernatural powers, that he could dematerialize or pass through walls, an idea fueled by the seemingly impossible ways he gained entry into locked homes. The satanic elements of his crimes only intensified these fears, leading some to believe the city was under assault by a literal demon. The media, while reporting the facts, also contributed to the myth-making by focusing on the most sensational aspects of the case. The constant coverage created a feedback loop of terror, where every new broadcast confirmed the public's worst fears and deepened the citywide trauma. Even amidst the terror, a bizarre and disturbing counter-reaction began to emerge. The Night Stalker, despite being a faceless monster, was becoming a legendary figure, a dark anti-hero in a real-life horror story. His brazenness and his allegiance to Satanism gave him a kind of outlaw mystique that, for a disturbed few, was strangely compelling. While the vast majority of the public was paralyzed with fear, the seeds of a future cult of personality were being sown in the shadows. This duality of extreme fear and morbid fascination defined the era. Los Angeles was a city at war with a ghost, a community held hostage by a single man who had managed to become the terrifying star of his own gruesome show. For months, law enforcement agencies across Los Angeles County struggled to connect the dots. The Night Stalker's crimes were scattered across different jurisdictions, and his lack of a consistent victim profile made it incredibly difficult to establish a pattern. Detectives were inundated with thousands of tips, but the Phantom left behind very little forensic evidence. He was careful, often wearing gloves, and the descriptions from the few survivors who saw his face were varied and unreliable. Investigators knew they were hunting a single prolific killer, but they had no name, no clear image, and no definitive leads. The pressure from the public and the media was immense, and the case felt like it was going nowhere, with each new murder adding to the frustration and desperation of the police. The breakthrough finally came on August 24, 1985. Ramirez broke into a home in Mission Viejo, shooting a man and assaulting his fiancée, Carol. Although traumatized, the woman survived the attack. Crucially, as Ramirez fled the scene, he made a critical error. A sharp-witted 13-year-old boy named James Romero, who was in his garage nearby, heard the commotion. Looking out, he saw Ramirez's strange car, a beat-up orange Toyota station wagon, speeding away. Thinking quickly, the boy jotted down the license plate number. This single, observant act by a teenager would be the key that unlocked the entire case. He gave the number to the police, providing them with the first solid, tangible piece of evidence they could use to track their suspect. The police traced the license plate to a car that had been reported stolen. They found the vehicle abandoned a few days later and processed it for evidence. Inside, they recovered a single fingerprint. This fingerprint was run through the state's new automated fingerprint identification system, a technology that was still in its infancy. The system returned a match. The print belonged to a 25-year-old drifter with a minor criminal record for theft and drug possession, Richard Munoz Ramirez. For the first time, the Night Stalker had a name and a face. Police immediately released his mugshot to the public, and on the evening of August 30, 1985, every television station and newspaper in California displayed the face of the man who had terrorized them for months. The end came swiftly and violently the next morning. Unaware that his identity had been revealed, Ramirez was on a bus heading to East Los Angeles. When he stepped off, he was immediately recognized by people on the street. A woman pointed at him and screamed, "El Matador, the killer." Realizing he had been spotted, Ramirez panicked and ran. A crowd of angry citizens gave chase, cornering him and beating him severely before police arrived to take him into custody. The reign of the Night Stalker was over, not in a dramatic shootout with police, but at the hands of the very public he had tormented. The monster had been unmasked and captured, brought down by a stolen car, a fingerprint, and the courage of ordinary people who refused to be victims any longer. The trial of Richard Ramirez was destined to be a media circus, and he seemed determined to play the starring role. From his first court appearance, he made it clear that he felt no remorse and held nothing but contempt for the legal system. He entered the courtroom with a swagger, flashing unsettling grins at the cameras and the victims' families. In one of his most infamous moments, he raised his left palm to the stunned courtroom, revealing a pentagram he had drawn on it. As cameras flashed, he growled the words, "Hail Satan!" This single act cemented his public image as an unapologetic disciple of evil, and set the tone for the spectacle that would follow throughout the lengthy and arduous trial. His behavior in court was consistently disruptive and menacing. He would sneer at witnesses, mutter threats under his breath, and attempt to intimidate the jurors who held his fate in their hands. The atmosphere was so tense that it felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a theatrical performance of pure malevolence. This was heightened by a bizarre and tragic incident involving one of the jurors. Ramirez was seen glaring at her and mouthing the words, "I will kill you." Shortly after, that same juror was found murdered in her home. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if Ramirez possessed the supernatural power to strike from behind bars. The truth, however, was far more mundane but no less tragic. The juror had been killed by her own husband in a domestic dispute completely unrelated to the trial. The prosecution methodically built its case, presenting an overwhelming mountain of evidence that linked Ramirez to 13 murders and dozens of other felonies, including sexual assault, burglary, and attempted murder. They brought forward eyewitnesses who had survived his attacks, forensic experts who matched his fingerprints and shoe prints to crime scenes, and ballistics evidence that connected him to the shootings. The sheer volume and brutality of the crimes laid out before the jury painted a portrait of a predator without conscience. Throughout the testimony, Ramirez remained defiant, often looking bored or amused by the horrific details being recounted, further underscoring his complete detachment from the human suffering he had caused. After years of legal proceedings, the jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to death in the gas chamber. When the sentence was read, he showed no reaction other than a slight, knowing smile. He had become a living embodiment of the horror genre, a real-life boogeyman who reveled in his own infamy. The trial did not provide closure or easy answers. Instead, it served as a public stage for Ramirez to project his dark persona, transforming his legal judgment into a final, defiant act of performance. He left the courtroom not as a defeated criminal, but as a convicted monster who had successfully turned his own trial into the last chapter of his terrifying legend. Sentenced to die, Richard Ramirez was transferred to California's San Quentin State Prison, home to the state's death row. One might expect a man responsible for such heinous acts to be reviled and forgotten, left to languish in isolation. However, the opposite occurred. In a deeply unsettling turn of events, Ramirez became a macabre celebrity. The same infamy that terrified a city now attracted a following. He began receiving thousands of letters, many of them from women who professed their love and admiration for him. These groupies saw him not as a brutal killer, but as a misunderstood rebel, a romantic anti-hero. They were drawn to his dark charisma and his defiant attitude, overlooking the monstrous reality of his crimes. This bizarre adoration was not just expressed through letters. Women would visit him in prison, send him gifts, and vie for his attention. Among these many admirers was Doreen Lioy, a freelance magazine editor who began writing to Ramirez in 1985. She became convinced of his innocence, and their correspondence blossomed into a twisted romance. Despite the protestations of her family and the public's disgust, Lioy's devotion never wavered. After years of visits and letters, she and Ramirez were married in a prison visiting room in 1996. The event garnered media attention, further fueling the public's fascination and horror. Ramirez, the servant of Satan who destroyed families, had managed to create one of his own from behind bars. His life on death row was largely one of routine, punctuated by these strange connections to the outside world. He never expressed remorse for his actions, and continued to embrace his persona as the Night Stalker. He granted interviews in which he would philosophize about evil, death, and Satan, further cultivating his myth. He reportedly married a second time while imprisoned, though details are less clear. His existence became a paradox. He was physically caged, his freedom completely stripped away, yet his legend continued to grow. He remained a potent symbol of evil, a figure of fascination for those drawn to the darkest corners of the human psyche, and a source of unending pain for the families of his victims. Ramirez would spend over 2 decades on death row, but he would ultimately cheat the executioner. The lengthy appeals process in California meant that his sentence was never carried out. On June 7, 2013, Richard Ramirez died in a Los Angeles hospital from complications related to B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old. Even in death, he remained defiant. His reported last words encapsulated his lifelong commitment to his dark identity. "I have no regrets. See you in Disneyland. I will return. I am an immortal soul and a faithful slave to the devil." He was caged, but his evil, in his mind and in the minds of some, was never truly contained. The death of Richard Ramirez did little to diminish the chilling legacy he left behind. His story continues to provoke a fundamental and unsettling question: was he born evil, or was he made into a monster? The evidence for his creation is compelling. His was a childhood defined by brutal physical abuse at the hands of his father, compounded by severe head injuries that could have permanently altered his brain chemistry and behavior. Then came the corrupting influence of his cousin Mike, who normalized unimaginable violence, and his brother-in-law Roberto, who gave that violence a satanic ideology. It is a textbook recipe for creating a sociopath, a tragic and horrifying journey from a damaged child to a remorseless predator. Yet, many who encountered him, from detectives to jurors, felt they were in the presence of something more than just a product of a troubled environment. They described a palpable coldness, an absence of humanity that seemed innate. Ramirez himself embraced this notion, claiming he was a servant of evil, born to kill. This narrative, which he so carefully cultivated, suggests a man who chose his path with full intention. Was his embrace of Satanism a genuine belief system, or was it a convenient justification for the dark desires that already lived within him? This nature versus nurture debate lies at the heart of his enigma, making him a perennial subject of study for criminologists, psychologists, and the morbidly curious public. His legacy is also cemented by his status as a landmark figure in the history of true crime. The Night Stalker case was a perfect storm of media sensationalism, public hysteria, and a uniquely terrifying villain. He was one of the first serial killers whose reign of terror unfolded in real time in the age of 24-hour news, turning his crime spree into a national obsession. His overt Satanism, his courtroom theatrics, and the strange cult of personality he inspired all contributed to his transformation from a mere criminal into a pop culture icon of evil. Decades later, his story is still retold in documentaries, books, and podcasts, a modern folktale about the boogeyman who truly existed. Ultimately, Richard Ramirez remains a potent symbol of the darkness that can fracture the sunny facade of society. He represents the terrifying randomness of violence and the fragility of safety. His story is a cautionary tale about the devastating impact of childhood trauma, but it is also a chilling exploration of a man who seemed to completely and joyfully surrender to his most monstrous impulses. Why did he become so evil? The question has no easy answer. He was a product of his circumstances, yes, but he was also the architect of his own monstrosity. His enduring legacy is not just in the pain he caused, but in the permanent, unsettling questions he left behind about the origins and nature of evil itself.